Okay, yes, so sorry, you've got me again for another 15 minutes, and I promise to be really quick so that you don't get bored of the sound of my voice. So, as Pete says, we're moving on to talk about autism and related challenges in people with Fragile X syndrome. And I just wanted to start really by mentioning this really interesting report from Embracing Complexity. Embracing Complexity is an umbrella organisation, a coalition of different different charities and researchers, all working towards a very similar goal. And they produced this really helpful report talking about co-occurring conditions across neurodevelopmental conditions, and really highlighted that many people with a neurodevelopmental condition have more than one, but that most services are not particularly well set up to support those really complex needs that come with that kind of co-occurrence, and also highlighting issues around diagnostic overshadowing, where one condition is considered to be, the primary cause, for want of a better word, of particular difficulties and behaviours, and other potential conditions are not therefore considered, and that leads to barriers in terms of appropriate support. So this was just a really helpful report, I think, for highlighting some of those issues. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term autism, but for those who are not, autism is a neurodevelopmental condition that is characterised by differences and difficulties in two key areas: in social communication skills, so that might be pragmatic communication skills like eye contact and gestures, social interaction skills, developing and maintaining friendships, and initiating in social interactions. And then in the area of repetitive behaviour and restricted interests, so engaging in repetitive behaviours, having very restricted and repetitive interests, but also an area which Kat's going to be focusing on in a moment, thinking about hyper and hyposensory reactivity, so sensory processing differences. So just again for a bit of context, in the general population, autism is thought to occur in around 1% of individuals. In those with a severe intellectual disability, that prevalence increases quite significantly to around 40%. And what we know in Fragile X syndrome is that actually those people with Fragile X syndrome are more likely to show autism characteristics than the general population. And in particular, this meta-analysis that was carried out by Caroline Richards showed that males with Fragile X syndrome are around 28 times more likely to show autism characteristics than individuals in the general population. And that for females, that figure is around 20 times more likely. So those with Fragile X syndrome are more likely to show these characteristics. Unfortunately, we also know that within this population of people with genetic syndromes as a whole, there is a real lack of awareness and understanding and recognition of autism characteristics from a clinical perspective. So the research rates that have been identified don't necessarily match particularly well with the clinical diagnostic rates, which suggests that there may be some clinical unmet need for individuals who show these autism characteristics, who would meet the criteria for autism but are not getting picked up in clinical pathways for some reason or another. And that has implications in terms of the support that people receive and the kind of environments that they are in terms of school and education that they end up kind of placed in. The impact of that unmet need is that, and this is from case studies and anecdotal evidence, that where autism characteristics are not recognised in individuals with a genetic syndrome, we might see challenges around behaviour, we might see challenges around mental health that kind of come downstream from the fact that those characteristics are not being picked up. So if people are, for example, are not in autism sort of sensitive environments for school purposes, that these things become more challenging. They're not in the right sort of environment, and therefore other things kind of occur downstream from that. So it's really important that it's really important that we kind of understand and identify autism characteristics within these populations, because it helps to shape these kind of support pathways that we might be thinking about. And so recognising when autism characteristics are high and taking this into consideration, it can be really helpful. And I think in Fragile X syndrome, this becomes even more of a prominent issue, because there is evidence to suggest that those with Fragile X syndrome who have a diagnosis of autism, or who have high levels of autism characteristics, have differences in terms of their clinical and behavioural outcomes relative to those with Fragile X syndrome who don't show those characteristics to the same extent, or who don't have a diagnosis of autism. And so that co-occurrence of autism changes the clinical outcomes and challenges that people are experiencing, and therefore the support that might need to be implemented. So actually it's really important that we can identify accurately those kind of characteristics and create better awareness of those challenges for individuals. But there are some challenges to this, and I know this is a bit of a busy slide, but I'll kind of take you through it. There are challenges in identifying autism in Fragile X syndrome, and one of those challenges is that, and one of the factors that makes identification much more complex, is that what we tend to see across all genetic syndromes actually is that the profile of autism characteristics in a particular genetic syndrome, in Fragile X syndrome, tends to look a little bit different to what we expect to see in somebody with autism who doesn't have a genetic syndrome. And those profiles tend to vary quite a lot across the different genetic syndromes. So this is a visual representation of that heterogeneity, and this work was led by Natalie, who I think you'll be hearing from later. And it's a visual representation here of the different profiles of autism characteristics that we see across the different groups. So here's Fragile X syndrome here, and you can see the sort of different kind of peaks and troughs of that sort of skyline that show the profile of autism characteristics. And here's a autistic group here, and you can see that there are some differences just visually in terms of the way that profile presents. And that makes it very challenging then to kind of identify accurately. But it also has some implications in terms of the nature of the support that we might want to put in place. So what does that look like then in practical terms? So research has suggested that actually when we compare individuals with Fragile X syndrome who meet cut-off for autism, or who meet clinical criteria for autism, to autistic individuals who don't have Fragile X syndrome, we see more challenges in those with Fragile X syndrome in relation to stereotype language, in relation to range of facial expressions. So actually those are more prominent than autistic individuals who don't have Fragile X syndrome. But actually we see fewer difficulties in certain aspects of social interaction. So in terms of social smiling, in terms of motivation for social interaction, quality of social interaction, and some of those, the nature of repetitive behaviours is actually a little bit different to what we would expect to see in autistic individuals who don't have Fragile X syndrome. And that motivation for social interaction, in particular, is less challenging for people with Fragile X syndrome relative to autistic individuals, or is different from those. I haven't got time to really mention too much about that today, but that may be specifically in relation to social anxiety that we see in Fragile X syndrome that sort of distinguishes autism in Fragile X syndrome from autistic individuals who don't have Fragile X syndrome. I see someone's got their hand up here.
What does stereotyped language mean?
So that is kind of repetitive language, or it may be paraphrasing language. So it may be almost like sort of delay. Pardon? Yes. Yeah. Sort of echolalic type language. So picking out, sentences or phrases that they hear that somebody may have heard elsewhere, and then applying them in different contexts, but with the same intonation and that sort of thing. So those kind of repetitive and repetitive use of language. Yeah. So I think it's really important to say that these differences in the profile of autism characteristics don't necessarily indicate less severity. And I think that's really important. We have seen in the literature before that people with Fragile X show milder characteristics. And I don't think we necessarily know that that is the case. Just because those presentations are different doesn't necessarily mean that they're less impactful and less challenging for people in their day-to-day life. So I think it's important that we start to think about this more about being that those with Fragile X syndrome who show autism characteristics do so in a very unique way, and that there is then a unique presentation of strengths and differences or strengths and challenges that relate to those autism characteristics. And I think that's really important that we do pick that up from the point of view of support and advice that we're seeking, because actually we need to recognise those differences and tailor our support in a very specific way. Obviously, we want to also focus on females with Fragile X syndrome, again, very underrepresented within the research evidence. So we're starting to sort of develop this line of work, and this was a paper that myself, Alice Wellham, and a clinical psychology trainee worked on, looking at the research that's been carried out in the past and trying to kind of summarise it in terms of the prevalence, the rates that we've seen of autism in females with Fragile X syndrome. So this research showed that the prevalence rates are quite variable, but we think around 14% of girls and females with Fragile X syndrome may show autism characteristics, and may be appropriate for diagnosis. I just wanted to raise that here. So we are starting to look at that. In terms of the presentation of those profile of autism characteristics in girls with Fragile X syndrome, we don't know very much about that just yet. When we look at the differences between males and females, so here we've got girls with Fragile X syndrome in the blue, boys in the orange, and then this is a neurotypical sample. So certainly the scores are higher in those with males Fragile X syndrome and lower in the girls with Fragile X syndrome. But again, I don't think we're talking about necessarily about severity here. We're just talking about differences in terms of the presentation. And one thing that we know from the autism community is that autistic females tend to be very good at masking some of the challenges that they experience, and that's not necessarily always an intentional thing, but sometimes it's something that people have adapted and modified the way that they interact in order to fit in with groups around them, and so we don't know how much that masking might be kind of coming into play here in girls with Fragile X syndrome. So that's something that we do need to look at. So just some concluding points there. And just in the interest of time, I just wanted to highlight this really. So one of the things that we are working on at the moment is a teacher training online resource for teachers and educational practitioners who are supporting people with genetic syndromes. So the aim of this resource is to improve knowledge and understanding of genetic syndromes in a school context and in educational context, and to better support those individuals. We've sort of co-created this with teachers and SENCOs. We've talked to parents and carers about what they want to see in there. And we're also working with senior educational psychologist Laura Wilby on this. And the content is going to be fairly broad, but with examples from different genetic syndromes, and Fragile X will feature in there. Videos, activities, infographics, all for kind of educational practitioners to work through. What we're looking for today, and we want to ask your help with this, is one of the things that we want to incorporate in this is a montage of parents and carers' hopes and aspirations for their children during their time in education, and to pull together those different thoughts and ideas to really try and empower the educational practitioners people are working with, and try and kind of really convey those ideas to teaching staff, So we are doing some video recordings today. We're just looking for kind of a couple of sentences. What are your hopes and aspirations for your children in education, in day to day or longer term? If you're happy to be recorded, please do come and talk to me or Kat. And we're really, really interested to hear from people and incorporate that into our teacher training module. So I'm going to hand over to Kat from now, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jo. So something related but a little bit different. So Jo talked about how we do see some sort of differences in the profiles of autistic traits. And you will have heard sort of a very odd phrase, social cognition, being said a couple of times in our bio. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But an easier way of thinking about this is thinking styles. So I'll explain a little bit about that. So the whole point behind this is that sometimes the differences that we see aren't always immediately obvious in people's behaviour. Sometimes it's more about their thinking processes. So that has come up. Okay. So we all sort of have our own different thinking styles. It's how we process information, and then how we process information often leads to our behaviours, because our behaviour is a response to the world and how we process these things. And we know that a lot of autistic people sort of perceive and understand, in particular, social information differently, and they have a sort of specific style of doing so. And the thought behind this is that these differences are what contribute to the social and communication traits or difficulties that we see in this group. And so we know that sort of there are unique profiles of social and communication traits in people with Fragile X syndrome. So understanding these different profiles and thinking styles is likely to be important for our understanding of these different traits. Okay. So there are lots of different sort of types of social processing differences. So one is about preference towards social versus non-social information. The other is being able to interpret other people's faces and their emotional expressions. The other is sensitivity to other people's eye gaze. So if someone's looking at something, often we'll look at what they're looking at in order to see what they're attending to and share information or about the world around each other and interact with each other. And then the last thing is about being able to understand thoughts and perspectives. So that's what I'm going to focus on for this particular about 10 minutes or so, because there's a lot out there, but I can't cover everything. So understanding other people's thoughts and perspectives of things like, what people like or don't like, or what they believe, or what they're thinking, or what they're feeling, and understanding that this can be different from our own thoughts and beliefs and that sort of thing. So the big question then is, are these differences at the sort of thinking processing level, is this what underlies autistic traits and the differences that we see in people with Fragile X syndrome? One of the major difficulties which we've had to sort of overcome is the fact that a lot of research doesn't include people with an intellectual disability or a genetic syndrome. So it's quite early work. It's not always immediately obvious how this might be related to your everyday life or perhaps, in clinical aspects. A lot of it is developing the different measures to do so. But I hope what you'll get from this is sort of an understanding of, how their social world is for people with Fragile X syndrome. Okay, so just to sort of drive this point home about the issue of measurement, so traditionally, sort of tasks looking at other people's perspectives or thoughts or beliefs, understanding of people's mental states and things like that, have often used story tasks. So the classic one is the Sally Ann task. And this is assessing someone's understandings that someone can have a belief that's both different from your own, but also different from reality. So often the story is told with dolls. So you say, this is Sally and this is Anne. Sally puts her ball in the basket. She then goes away. Then naughty Anne moves the ball to her box. And then when Anne comes back, we ask the person the critical question, where will Sally look for her ball when she comes back? And if you have sort of this understanding of other people's false beliefs, then you will say that Sally will put the ball in her basket. She will look in her basket because that's where she put it. But if you don't, then you will say where Anne has put it. So hopefully that makes sense. If anyone's not sure, do just let me know. I'm hoping that you can see why this might be a bit of an issue with a lot of people with Fragile X syndrome. So one of the things is that it's a single task. It doesn't really tell us about the variability of differences that we see between people with Fragile X and autistic people. But the obvious one is the language and memory demands. It's not suitable for a lot of children who might struggle to remember a lot of things, might not have the language abilities. And this is really apparent because this assessment is really only good at detecting these sorts of things from people who have at least an age of, sort of a mental age of 4 years and above. So one of the first things that we tried to do was try to overcome this. So developing tasks that younger people and people who aren't able to talk or speak can engage in, but look at these sort of thinking processes. So what we did was we looked at a sort of precursor to these abilities, which is sort of a more basic understanding of other people's intentions. So based on someone's actions, can we sort of understand what their intention is behind that action? And we took a developmental perspective because actually there's a whole range of these sort of abilities that sort of build up upon one another for us to be able to form a shared intention with another person. So an easy way of thinking about this is forming a shared goal, and this is really important for things like being able to cooperate with another person. I don't think the video is going to work, which is a real shame because there are some videos of some really cute kids doing some really, really, really sweet things. So I'll just describe it to you, but I hope you have a picture of your head. And if you want to see, come up and I'll show you the video. It's very, very cute. So it starts off with very early developing and simple understanding of intentions. So if you drop an object, so there's lots of videos of me dropping an object and me stretching to try and get it because it's out of reach. And what we want to see is whether children understand the intention behind that action. They understand I'm intending to try to pick the object up and see whether they pick it up and give it back to me or not. And that's something that Fragile X, children with Fragile X kids were really good. They were really, really helpful. It was lovely. And then this builds up to that idea of cooperation, so being able to have a shared goal. So usually from a play-based activity, there's, for example, having a toy in the middle of a big tube, that's quite long. Having a couple of goes of pulling that tube together. So the toy comes out, but then seeing what happens when the examiner just completely stops what they're doing. Whether children just try and do it by themselves or whether they try and re-engage the examiner to be able to do that together and show that shared intention. Again, very, very, very sweet video that I can't show you. Oh, what a shame. So I'm going to jump into a bit of the data, but I just wanted to make a point here about you'll see that there are some other genetic syndromes. So often what we do is sort of compare people with Fragile X syndrome to other genetic syndromes that have a similar level of sort of intellectual ability, but they differ in terms of their profiles of autistic traits. And the reason for that is that it's really helpful for us to know whether any differences that we see in people with Fragile X syndrome is specific to those for having a diagnosis of Fragile X syndrome rather than just having a genetic syndrome in general. So just wanted to make that point quickly. So apologies for the graph. It is horrendous and I need to change it and I say it every single time. But I think this data is really interesting because it really shows you some quite distinctive strengths and difficulties in people with Fragile X syndrome, which is different from autistic individuals and also those with genetic syndromes. So we looked at the development of these abilities, so how quick are they to develop these abilities relative to their mental age, but also the order that they develop these abilities as well, because this can sort of tell us a bit about the different reasons underlying sort of any difficulties with development. So I'll start off with this graph. So we have the number, let's cut it off as well. This is the number of tasks that they passed in the battery, so it's a battery of 6 tasks. And then this is their non-verbal mental age plotted at the bottom. And we've got some lines of best fit. So this nice sort of line up here is the neurotypical group. This is sort of what we generally expect in terms of their mental age. And then this very flat line here is the autism group. And the first thing you sort of notice is there's just not really that progression, is there? Well, this is the Fragile X kids that we had, the young boys. And what you notice is actually they showed quite similar levels of social and communication autistic traits as the autistic, they were quite high, but they were a bit delayed, they were a bit slow, but they were developing these abilities. They're just taking them a little bit longer, but actually they're developing them at a better rate, at a faster rate, than the two other genetic syndrome groups. And as I said, they were really helpful. They were really, really lovely. So I hope you can sort of see the strengths. We often talk about the difficulties, but I think it's really nice to see the strengths as well. So they might struggle, they might be a little bit behind, but they do develop these skills. And then the second part was looking at sort of the strengths and difficulties here. And what we sort of see here is that there's a really, really clear they were really good at understanding the simple intentions. So when someone's dropping a pen, what are they trying to do? If they're not able to achieve an activity, will they sort of do that activity for another person? But there was a huge drop-off for these sorts of abilities here, which are a little bit more complicated and are sort of required for sharing. What sort of characterises these particular skills in general is something called joint attention. So this is a sort of what we call a social referencing skill. It's basically being able to follow other people's attention to a shared object, and then being able to sort of build on that, and also being able to direct other people's attention as well. And I don't think it's necessarily a lack of motivation from these kids. It's just that sometimes they're not really picking up what is going on in terms of social cues around the environment, which I think is just stopping them from perhaps developing these abilities in other ways. But they are developing them, so it might be that they're finding sort of alternative ways to do so. Cool. And this is just a quick slide. It's a bit of a jump to talk about strengths and weaknesses, but the other thing I wanted to highlight was the level of variability that we see in children as well. I'm sure that if you've met lots of people with Fragile X syndrome, you'll see there's lots of variation. We see this in the data as well. And part of this variation might be related to how good their sort of thinking skills are as well. And we've just to say we've got some evidence of that, because often we describe these things, but we don't always link these things to the actual outcomes. But I just wanted to demonstrate that these abilities are related to some of the important social skills. So that was really a first start, but it was quite a broad start. And our next sort of, we wanted to go a little bit deeper and a little bit to understanding exactly some of the skills. And this is where eye tracking has sort of come in. So we're still sort of thinking about the behavioural level when we were doing the last tasks. But with technology, we can understand so much more about their processing and the information that they're taking in their environment through things like eye tracking to see exactly where they're looking. And again, this is a real opportunity to show, I think, where some of their advantages are in this situation as well. So thinking back about that sort of original traditional task that I was referring to, and all of those sort of language abilities and showing that, there's a lot of literature to say they really struggle with that, that's true. But what's really interesting, I think, is when you take those language abilities, those language demands away. And again, it's such a shame I can't show you the video. I don't know how to make it play. But what we did was we made an implicit task where we sort of replicated that situation of a false belief task. So you can see a little pig there. He pops an object in a box whilst the character or the agent is sort of watching. But when she moves away, the pig then takes the object out of the box. And then what we're doing is all the way through that, we're looking at what are they attending to, what are they processing, where are they looking? And then at a critical point, when the agent comes back and there's a flash, we're looking at where are they looking? We're trying to see our children anticipating where that agent is going to be, where that agent is going to look for that object. And what we found was a real sort of distinctive difference between a performance on this tasks and then the tasks in which they have to sort of verbally express that answer. So we've got sort of a neurotypical group here, an autistic group, a group with CDLS and Fragile X. So we didn't actually see any differences between people with Fragile X syndrome and the other groups, but there are some things that we can sort of pick up visually. So first off is that higher numbers means more anticipatory looking, and the neurotypical kids seem to be doing that. And then we replicated previous findings which just showed that the autistic kids were just not anticipating where they were looking at all. Now, in the genetic syndrome groups, we do see in the CDLS group that they show performance that's significantly different from the autistic group. We don't see this in Fragile X syndrome, but you'll see this sort of line here is showing basically, it shows a whole, it shows how variable the responses are in the children with Fragile X syndrome. So even though on average they're showing sort of anticipatory looking, we're not seeing a big difference between the other groups because there's so much variation. And again, I think this really reflects what we see at the behavioural level. We see there's so many differences sometimes in the children with Fragile X syndrome. But it's not completely not there. So it just paints a really, really interesting picture, I think. So just to summarise, I've probably already chatted a bit too much, but I want to get onto the sensory processing. Yeah, still very early on, still trying to get information together to paint a bit of a clearer picture. But I hope it gives you a little bit of an insight into their social world and how they're sort of processing their social world and what they're good at and what they're not so good at. The first point to make, I suppose, is that there are some definite strengths, and they understand quite clearly when other people are struggling to achieve a goal, and they're very helpful and they're very motivated. But there are some difficulties in being able to understand other people's cues and to use their own cues to sort of achieve that joint intention together. But they do develop, it just takes them a little bit longer. So just keep an eye out for that if you've got young kids, I think. There is some evidence to say that these skills do predict some important social skills, which I know should seem obvious, but sometimes we're not very good at showing that in research. And then the other thing is to think about measures and more sensitive measures, which are not sort of pressing on those language demands as much. So some children with Fragile X syndrome are able to automatically process other people's mental states. It's just that they have real difficulty being able to describe them verbally. And this variability might be sort of explaining why we see variability in the social ability. So just to pull everything together, but still, as you can say, very, very early days. Okay, now to move on for something completely different. Just checking. So I'm sort of taking a slightly different direction now. Sorry, it's not as smooth a changeover as I'd like to be, but it's related to the autism phenotype for the reasons that I'll go. But I'll just go through what I'm going to discuss for now. So I know sensory processing seems to be something that comes up quite a lot, so I wanted to take a bit of time to talk about it. So I'm going to talk about what is sensory processing, with a particular focus on sensory reactivity, which I'll explain in a second. I'll explain what the literature is currently saying about what sensory reactivity looks like in people with Fragile X, and then also demonstrate a bit of a link with anxiety. There's some associations with that might be important to recognise. And then I'm a researcher, I'm not a clinician, but I've got some suggested strategies that you might want to think about if you think that this is something that's relevant to your child or to yourself as well. Okay. So we've talked quite a lot about the social and communication differences in this group, but what has been sort of very much overlooked is this sort of hyper or hypo-reactivity to sensory input in people with Fragile X syndrome. So sensory processing is extremely prevalent in autistic people, and there's lots of different accounts from autistic people who don't have a learning disability describing how it leads to a lot of day-to-day sort of functional issues and mental health issues as well. But the point I just want to make is that it's really under-researched, I think, even in autistic populations as well, because it's only recently been acknowledged in diagnostic categories within since 2013, which in the research world isn't a lot of time. And it's really just sort of been shoved under the umbrella of restricted and repetitive patterns of behaviours and interests. But there is some argument to say it should be sort of its own domain. So I'm going to explain what reactivity means in a second, but I just wanted to make the point here to say that sensory reactivity differences, although it's sort of part of the autism phenotype or diagnostic criteria, it's not just relevant to autistic people. It's seen across lots of different neurodevelopmental conditions. Even neurotypical people as well have them. I think there's an estimate about 20% of neurotypical people have atypical sensory reactivity. So if you're seeing these but your child doesn't have a diagnosis, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go and seek support. So I just wanted to make that clear before going on. Okay, so what is sensory processing? Lots of people use this word, but we're not always very clear what it means, and sometimes when we say it, we're talking about different aspects. So I'm just going to talk about a very specific type of sensory processing, which is people's reactions to sensory information out in the world. And that's sensory reactivity, which is what the autism diagnostic criteria refers to. So that's all about how people's responses to sensory information, so in particular how intense the response is relative to how intense that sensory information is. I'll speak mostly about that, but I'll signpost the other aspects just in case you think you might benefit from getting support from occupational therapists or things like that. So there's also sensory-based motor difficulties. So this is a mixture of sort of difficulties with posture and keeping balance when moving, or dyspraxia, which is about difficulties with planning and executing movements and sequences. So these kids often seem quite accident-prone and struggle with ball sports, but also things like fine motor skills. And they can learn to get better at this. It just takes lots and lots of practice and a bit longer. And then there's also sensory discrimination disorder as well. So this is about these children or people who can detect sort of sensory aspects in the environment and have appropriate responses to them. They just really struggle with distinguishing between the different types of senses. So just something to keep an eye on. But I'll focus now on profiles of sensory reactivity. So I'll talk about what these are and the fact that we can have very different profiles between different children with different, we can have sort of different profiles of sensory reactivity. So sensory reactivity is often broken down into 3 different subtypes, all of which are referring to how people might have atypical responses to sensory information. So sensory over-responsivity is when people respond to sensory information faster or for longer or for more intense, or that it's more intense than usual. And it tends to be it's a response usually to unexpected sensory information rather than something that's self-generated. On the complete flip side of that is sensory under-responsiveness, which is characterised by a lack of responding to sensory information as if they're sort of not aware of the information. And as a result, they might not explore the environment around them or might appear quite withdrawn. It's not intentional. Some people think it's laziness in children. It's not. It's just they're not picking up what's going on in the world around them. And at this point, this is a good point to introduce this idea of the sort of optimal engagement band. So hopefully you can sort of imagine why being too over-responsive or too under-responsive isn't good. We sort of need to be in a middle level in order to engage with the environment around us. And that's in lots of different situations. That's in social situations, that's in sort of educational situations as well, in order to attend and sort of manage our emotions and our responses. So we want to be sort of in that sort of area. So if you've got kids or you struggle with this yourself, because it's quite normal across neurotypical populations, it's important to sort of find yourself regulated and get into that optimal band. And here is a good sort of segue into sensory seeking. So sensory seeking is a little bit different and is often sort of seen as a way to get back into that optimal level of engagement band. So often it's in children who are under-responsive or who sort of crave sensory stimulation to sort of get back into that sort of regular level. And sometimes children can be very determined to get this. It can sometimes come across as quite aggressive if they don't meet their needs. But it really is just sort of a coping strategy for when they're just sort of not getting the things that they need. And then the final point here is just to say that these different profiles can occur across all different types of sensory information. So we've got sensory information from the outside and the environment, such as touch, sound, sights and smells, but also a lesser known thing is the sort of internal sensations that we have. So sort of the vestibular system, which is all about balance, and proprioception, which is all about where our body is in movement, in space and understanding what our movements are doing as well. They're both related. So what do these actually look like? What does atypical sensory reactivity look like? This can be really different for everyone. Everyone can sort of show their own different behaviours. But I'll give some examples to look out for that might indicate sort of atypical sensory reactivity for each of the sort of sensory domain. So starting off with sensory overreactivity, if you have touch, you might have very strong aversion to sort of certain textures or certain clothes. For sounds, you might sort of see lots of startle responses or distressing sounds, or putting your sort of hands over your ears. Sort of, I'm sure this sort of lots of you have probably seen this at different points. For sight, you know, the classic one is sort of bright lights, but lesser known ones which are a little bit more subtle are sort of difficulty with busy backgrounds and if there's just sort of too much going on. Taste and smell, you know, obviously if you've got an aversion to certain perfumes, yeah, sort of the obvious ones there. And then movement, these are things like being dizzy from like rocking chairs or swings and that sort of thing. In terms of sensory underreactivity, it doesn't, just to say there aren't examples for all of them. There's lots in overreactivity, but not for the others. But for underreactivity, the answer is for touch, someone might not notice if you just tap them on the shoulder, for instance, or might have a slow response to pain. For sounds, they might not sort of show any awareness or response to things like alarms or the vacuum or that sort of thing. And then for sight, they might not be aware of something that's new to the environment. So if you've just put like an object that's quite close to them, they might just sort of not acknowledge it. And then sensory seeking, wrapping yourself up really tightly is a typical one for touch. For sight, sort of looking at things which are spinning a lot. And smells, you know, if they're really interested in the smell, sometimes smells of other people, which can be a little bit awkward as well. And then movement, we've sort of seen the spinning and that sort of thing, yes.
Can I ask a question? My son likes a lot to chew. We have like these chew tube things.
Yeah.
And I wondered how, if at all, that fits into this slide.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, it could be lots of different things, couldn't it?
Can I just say, I was told from the OT that it's to do with the jaw muscles and this proprioception. It's
Yes.
calming, isn't it? That's why they chew a lot, and they say for children that are sort of overwhelmed to give them something to chew.
Yeah, I think the thing is that there can be lots of different reasons, and so it wasn't immediately obvious because it could be the proprioception, it could be taste and smell. I think sometimes, because we measure these things in the behavioural responses, we're very good at describing them, but that sometimes there can be sort of lots of different underlying reasons for them. So it's not always clear exactly where these behaviours lie. So I think it's easier to describe them, but the point I want to make is sometimes it's difficult to know exactly what's causing it, and the best thing to do is to sort of get an OT. But the best, often it's good to. I was going to say if you're sort of concerned about atypical sensory activity, the best thing to do is try and record as much you can the behaviours that you're seeing and the environments that you're seeing them in as well. Because if you've got that information, you've already got a lot of information that you can go to an OT, but you can also sort of work out what it might be, because you sort of need that complete picture. But yeah, and sometimes it can be quite unique to each child as well. So these are sort of the common things that we might see in questionnaires, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some quite unique behaviours in each of your child. Yeah, fab. I hope that helps. Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Do children fit into just one of these, or can they overlap? Can they
Yeah.
do one on one day and another on another day, or like from hour to hour?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, the thing that I forgot to mention in the previous slide is that, which I thought you were going to talk about, was that you can have sort of overreactivity in one domain and underreactivity in another domain. But I think, it's sort of, there's lots of different things that can change it. So if children are more stressed, for example, things might become more relevant to them in their environment, and it might be more overwhelming because they're already quite stressed, because it's all part of the nervous system and our fight and flight responses. But I would have thought it'd be quite consistent, I think, but the best thing to do is to record, I think, over several days to see if it's something that's consistent. And the other thing to keep in mind is some of these behaviours will be absolutely appropriate for their developmental age as well. So sort of putting things in your mouth is very developmentally appropriate for, say, a young infant, because that's how they learn about the world. And then these are all quite normal behaviours. It's just thinking about when is it starting to look atypical? Is it developmentally appropriate, or is it causing sort of issues or anxiety issues and things like that? Okay. So I'm just aware it's 11:30. Shall I carry on? Okay. I'll try and whiz through. The other thing is sometimes it's just not obvious. So sometimes these behaviours are really clear. Sometimes it can come across as aggression as well if they are really stressed out. So I would just really encourage you to be really curious about your children's behaviour. Because it can come across as being quite like adamant, willful behaviour or sort of problematic, but actually it might be because they're just, they're not getting their sensory needs met. So if you're a bit unsure about what's causing some challenging behaviour, it's a possibility for you to look at. Hello. Yeah.
The chewing part that I find in my son, it's either anxiety.
Yes.
He'll take his cap and
Yeah.
start chewing.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
bite his t-shirt or hand flapping.
Yes, that sounds a little bit sensory seeking. So one thing I will say is the sensory seeking element of it it's not particularly as well defined as those immediate reactions, and I think there's sometimes a bit of confusion as to is it someone who's overstimulated or understimulated? Is it a reaction to sensory stimuli, or actually is it a regulation behaviour? And that's where it gets a little bit fuzzy. But I talk a little bit later about anxiety, and I think that's a really, sometimes it can be used as a really helpful tool as well. It just sort of depends on the context. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, it seems to me what we've got here is you've got how a child senses the world, then you've got the cognitive perception of
Yeah.
that, and then how you emotionally regulate
Yeah.
that. And then when you start to think about sensory seeking, it's the response
Yeah.
to that triad.
Yeah, absolutely.
really. So then it becomes more of a circle.
Yeah.
So then they're saying, right, how I've got this feeling now as a result of how I've made sense of what's happened to me.
Yeah.
What am I going to do to respond?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not completely, this is how they sort of separate it out in the sort of assessments, but as I said, it gets a little bit fuzzy around here, and there needs to be more work, I think, in defining exactly what this is. But there's a bit of an issue, I think, with the sort of taxonomy of sensory experiences. And when we say reactivity, we are looking at responses. We're not talking about what's going on inside the brain, and I'm actually going to talk a little bit about that next if people aren't absolutely itching to go to get coffee. But sort of research-wise, it does get a little bit fuzzy, but I think you're exactly right there. Okay. Okay. So, yeah, I'm sure it will be of no surprise to many of you to know that the majority of the literature that is out there characterises these profiles in people with Fragile X syndrome with over-responsivity. Is this sort of true does this reflect most people's? Yep. Oh, well, yep. Knowing the kids that I've worked with as well, that's very very much what I've seen. The majority of it's been around touch and sounds, but there has been a little bit specifically on sight and taste and smell as well. Yeah, I was going to ask you a question, so good to know. And I think this is a little bit about what we were talking before. So the reasons why we see these reactions. So overreactivity is talking about people's responses. So this could be their behaviours or their sort of neurophysical responses like heart rate and things. And the big reason for this is how they process the world around them and the sensory information. So most of the sort of research around it has about how children or how people with Fragile X syndrome process sensory information has been around sounds, but I think there's sort of a global sort of Fragile X brain in general. So the bigger thing being that when they detect sort of information in our brain, the responses, the neural responses tend to be much bigger than most people, so it's more intense. They're not as good as inhibiting these neural responses either, and this sort of leads to slower habituation. So when we hear a sound, what our brains will do, we'll go, oh, okay, yeah, I've a big response to that, that's new, and then eventually it will sort of get used to it. Whereas actually a lot of people with Fragile X, their brain doesn't do it, so it's just intense for a much longer time, and as a result, we get these sort of behaviours here. So it's not really sort of an intervention thing, but for me, it just really helps me to put myself in that person's shoes when they're in that situation. And again, and someone mentioned this idea of anxiety. So there's lots of different consequences on different aspects of well-being, but sort of the best, the most well-documented is this sort of association with anxiety. And what I would say is actually sort of when you're looking at, again, these are behavioural responses, there's a lot of overlap with sort of anxious responses. So they're sort of hitting onto sort of similar things. And this can occur in sort of social as well and non-social situations. So the point I sort of wanted to make really was that a lot of these sort of responses that we're seeing to sensory stimuli are very much reflective in that sort of fight and flight response. That's always the immediate thing. And to me, this is a really important aspect. So into thinking about how automatic these processes are, how just challenging these places can be in the world can be for people with Fragile X syndrome. So even if, children aren't being naughty, they just don't feel they don't feel safe, they feel very stressed, and actually they're doing things to help themselves regulate and to adapt within their environment. So that's just the main point that I wanted to make. And then what do we do about it? So I'm just going to whiz through really quickly. I'm sure lots of you sort of know a lot of these things, but the best thing, ideally what we want to do is stop them from getting to that fight-flight mode. And the ideal way of doing this is adapting their environment, because it's just completely overwhelming. So I've got lots of different sort of ideas around this, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with. I won't go into too much detail, but making sure the clothes are comfortable, making sure they're not using like laundry detergent, that's too itchy on your skin. Ear defenders are a really good one, but listening out for some of those smaller sounds, those sort of nigglier sounds that they're more hypersensitive to that other people might not be aware of. With the visual aspects of it, the visual boards of not having things that are too cluttered is probably one that isn't as well known, and I would suggest having a look at the cerebral visual impairment if you're worried about that. They've got really good tips on that, but I've definitely noticed sort of sometimes bright lights and things like that when we've done eye tracking can be a bit of an issue. Taste and smell, using non-fragranced sort of laundry detergent, or changing the texture of food if they're sort of coming up with that, and then movement, if you get motion sickness or dizziness, sort of helping them to keep looking at a fixed spot. And these are all quite obvious examples, I think, but I think the challenge really is just trying to work out exactly what it is that is causing your child's difficulty. So I hope it sort of opens you up to some of these ideas to think about how to get them into the optimal engagement band. And then I'm just going to finish off really quickly, I'm taking up so much of your time, about those times when you can't control the world around you and you can't control the sensory world, which is really, really, you know, life happens, unfortunately. And what I suggest is that you have sort of regulation and calming strategies that you can use anywhere. The big thing, I'm sure lots of you have some under your belt, but the thing to remember is to have it there for the moments, have a practice of these before you're in a stressful environment so that you know that they're there, your child knows what to do, and then you can just sort of carry them out. If you can see that situation is coming up but it's unavoidable, you can preempt it by getting them to start to do that particular activity, whether it's fidget spinners or a comfort blanket or anything. Otherwise, try and find grounding techniques for after the fact, if you do become, you know, if your child does become extremely over-aroused, just know, have a action plan for afterwards. Try and be a calming present. I know it's really hard sometimes if you're in a stressful situation, but I've seen with these kids, and this is talking from my experience, if I get stressed, they pick that up so well. They are just, they've just got that third eye, I think. They just know what's going on. They're very perceptive. And so if you can, as much as possible, I know it's hard sometimes, try and be really calming and keep demands down, because when you are really stressed out, I know for myself, I just can't think straight. So if it's in an academic setting, just take away the task demands, not too many things at once, and give you both a bit of a break. Allow some recovery time. This is really important. Being in fight and flight mode takes up a lot of energy, and this is for the both of you if you're both feeling quite stressed as well. So yeah, try and be kind on yourself as well, because it can be stressful in all sorts of different situations. And yeah, I did have a discussion point, but I've already taken a lot of your time. So I will stop there. Any questions, please come and talk to me afterwards. Thank you.